Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Hoss Talks Boss. I'm the Hoss, Matt Yonkovit, and I am here to talk to JD, Joshua Drake, the founder and the lead over at Command Prompt, who's been doing Postgres from, since the early days of Postgres. How you doing, JD?
I'm doing pretty good. It's funny you say early days. It's basically the beginning days.
Yes. Yeah, like you started Command Prompt in what, 97?
Command Prompt started in 97, and we were actually doing things with Postgres 95, which was the precursor project to PostgreSQL before we started with PostgreSQL.
Wow. Yeah. So you've been in there since the very beginning. And, I started my MySQL career, somewhere in that mid 90s. I started working around MySQL and started to look at open source databases. I'm ashamed to say that I actually started doing a lot of Oracle back then as well, but I don't do that anymore. I haven't touched it in 15 years.
Yeah, you got to pay the bills sometimes.
Well, you had to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And I think we all started at a little different place. Now, out of curiosity, like what kind of grabbed your attention around Postgres back in those early days?
So it's interesting. So first, I started as just a Linux guy, way back with the SLS distribution. Most people haven't heard of it. SLS is what Slackware is based on, what SUSE eventually was based off of, way before Red Hat or before Ubuntu was even a thing, or Debian for that matter. And basically, I got fired from my last job because I am not a very good employee. But I'm just not. It's too easy for me to look at you and say, what? And started Command Prompt. Originally, Command Prompt started as a Linux hosting kind of shop, because this is right when the internet was starting to take off and companies were starting to no longer allow you to have shell access. So we started like $5 a month. You get a shell. You can do whatever you want. Just, we catch you hacking, we kick you off, that kind of thing. And we did a lot of, intermediary web development with Perl and, fast CGI and things like that. And we needed a database. And literally, I just downloaded Postgres 95 and kind of fell into it. And then as we grew over the years and became full-time in the very early 2000s, we were already profitable. We were already working with PostgreSQL exclusively. And I called a company called GreatBridge. Now, GreatBridge was the original VC.com bubble PostgreSQL company. They had, Bruce Momjun, the core member, Jan Wick from Germany, Tom Lane. They had four of the core members and a bunch of other people. Ned Lilly, who's now in Xtuple, the founder of Xtuple, actually. And I said, hey, look, we're consultants. We're doing this. And we just need a tier 4 company that maybe we might have to call once a year. How much is that going to cost? $15,000. $15,000 for maybe one incident a year. That phone call made me completely change the direction of Command Prompt into a full service boutique, PostgreSQL 24/7, the whole bit. And GreatBridge was out of business 8 months later. They were just way ahead of it. And frankly, they're still way ahead of their time because they didn't understand the market. Their leadership didn't understand the market. And it allowed us to continue to just grow and flourish. And now it's 2022. And I am no longer a young man, but not yet quite an old man.
Yeah, I feel that, right? Yeah, feel that one.
So that's how we got started.
Okay. And so over the years, you have done a lot in this space, including a lot of conferences. You've been very active in the community. It's something that, you as an individual, but also as a company have been incredibly, kind of central to the activities that are going on. In fact, last week I was at your conference and
you were at Postgres conference. It's not my conference.
Okay. Well, the conference you put on.
Yes. I'm the lead organizer.
You organized.
But we do have a whole team. It's a 501c3. It's not Command Prompt's conference. And the only reason I bring it up is because we don't want it to be Command Prompt's conference. right? We want to, it's why we want, if it was Command Prompt's conference, we wouldn't want Percona there, right? We want it to be the community's professional conference. We want it to be the opportunity for anybody and everybody to come and learn, network, connect, and in this particular instance, see old friends, because it was the first in-person we'd done since 2019.
Indeed. Yeah. It's been crazy the last 2 years without in-person conferences.
Yes, it absolutely has. Postgres conference, Postgres World, like many conferences, Percona Live, for example, I believe you did this too. We switched to a digital format and we continue to build. In fact, we had some Percona people give some webinars so that we can continue to fill the education gap and the video gap, through YouTube and through our own site. Because we didn't want, one of the most important things, especially with open source, is education. And we want everyone to have free access to that content to allow them to succeed with Postgres, because that's how you're going to beat Oracle. That's how you're going to beat Microsoft SQL. That's how you're going to beat MySQL, by making sure that the groundswell of infrastructure has an open source ethic, and that includes the education.
Yeah, and it's becoming more and more important because from an education perspective, and my personal experience is, we're seeing a shift in a lot of the companies who are running Postgres or other open source databases, where they're now providing their own kind of mini platforms as a service offerings internally, and their end users have zero or very little actual database experience, but they just kind of give them some basic framework and say, here you go, just go ahead and do your thing. And while that's cool that they can do a lot of automation to build those out, in a lot of cases it leads to some just horrendous design decisions and some horrendous code and a few horrendous things. And you probably have experienced that. I have. Certainly.
I mean, one of my favorites to this day, because Command Prompt does a lot of work with what I call old money companies that they're not interested in your fly-by-night shop. They like the fact that we've been around for so long. We understand how older businesses, bigger businesses do work. But my favorite example is, my boss connected to the database with Excel. And out of my mouth every time is, why in God's name did you allow him to do that? And they're like, well, he's the boss. I'm like, yeah, but when he deletes everything, you're the one that gets fired. Right? You have to have some kind of controls over that. And, just opening up a port with a username in a database and saying, go for it, is not always the best case.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, and I think that this has led to a plethora of problems, right? And the talk that I gave at the conference last week was all about, the development side and users kind of shaping the future of where Postgres is going to go. And, some of the numbers from, different places that I pulled out, the sizes of these environments are growing, and there's less DBAs, less DBREs, whatever you want to call them nowadays, SREs, to actually enforce those standards. So we're seeing things like more outages as opposed to less. We're seeing more security issues as opposed to less, more slowdowns as opposed to less. But we're also just seeing more of everything, right? It's insane. Maybe like 5 years ago, it's like, ooh, we might have hundreds of databases that we manage or, maintain. You're like, ooh, that's pretty big. And now we're talking thousands, right? Because everybody wants their own database, like every application, every microservice. I want my own little piece of the pie. And I think that has led to a lot of crazy complexity.
Well, it's all in the argument of simplification, right? I mean, like no code movement and things like that. And the counter argument is, okay, sure, you can fire up this microservice or this serverless container, or you can do this or this or this, and you can use these macros. But the reality is these people don't know what they're doing. And you wouldn't put a 12-year-old in a car and say, hit the freeway. You just wouldn't do it. And the idea that you have people that can't program a VCR suddenly in charge of critical infrastructure, or something that may become critical infrastructure, I mean, it's great for you and I, because eventually they are going to have to call us, right? That eventually it will happen. Some event will happen, and they didn't have their point-in-time recovery set up. They didn't have their disaster recovery set up. They hadn't taken backup in 3 months. They got XID wraparound, whatever. and they're going to call us, and they're not going to be on a support contract, so it's going to be double time, and then it's going to be on a Sunday, so it's triple time, and it's just going to be bad all around. And then they say to themselves, well, why did this happen? This isn't supposed to happen. And it's because you put a 12-year-old in a car and let him go off on the freeway.
So how much of that do you think is driven by some of the tooling and some of the marketing around some of the tooling around, the no code, low code solutions, or even like the fully managed databases that are out there? I mean, are we kind of fooling people into a false sense of security?
Look at Atlassian.
Do you think?
I mean, Atlassian just is looking at 3 weeks outage at this point, 4 weeks outage at this point, because they told everybody, trust us, we got this. Now, don't get me wrong. Bad things happen. And I'm not saying they did anything wrong. I don't know if they did anything wrong. But what I do know is the fact that they can't just restore. Maybe you lose an hour worth of data. Maybe. But the fact that you cannot bring a client back up and they can't even tell you or communicate with you whether or not you're going to get your data back, that's a serious problem. Right? I mean, and
it's crazy.
It's smart, though. Think about it. If you go to say, well, I'm not going to name a cloud provider, but one of the big cloud providers, the only thing they guarantee you is that they won't go down, or if they do go down, it's within certain parameters. And if they go beyond that, you get certain credits back. They don't guarantee your data. They don't guarantee your backups.
Right.
They don't guarantee your integrity. They're selling you essentially co-location with a pretty, console is what they're doing.
Yeah. And I mean, so we do a survey regularly, and one of the things that came out of that was those running in the cloud, right? They had said 22% of our, hundreds of users who responded to this said that they had been impacted by some sort of cloud outage in the last year, right? So it's not like, it's bulletproof, but, with automation comes scale, and with scale comes additional problems. I had someone on the podcast who works at Pinterest not too long ago, and he said, yeah, we've got thousands of instances running, and they're on MySQL, but he said, hey, I've got almost 2,000 instances. At that rate, you're going to hit all of the weird bugs, because when you've got multiple instances, that means, guess what? If you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of hitting this critical bug, and I've got 2,000 instances, guess what? I'm going to hit it twice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was like, oh yeah, you're right. And I think that's the interesting thing about automation and the growth that we're seeing is we take a problem that might be relatively minor or impact one thing, and then we automate it 1,000 times over, and it becomes 1,000 times the problem. And I'm not saying automation is bad. It's great. It's just there is some downside, and there is some things you need to be careful.
Technology is perfect, right? And humans, by their very nature, are lazy. And I'll give you a perfect example. This was a few years ago, but there was a Node.js library, I think it was, and it was sitting on a public S3 bucket. And it was being used by hundreds of thousands of websites, including some that you would say, why in the world, pull it off to your own bucket, pull it off to your own web server, whatever. Why are you doing this? And S3 went down in a region and shut down a good portion of the web. Just boom, gone for a couple hours. Because the individuals in charge of the infrastructure were so lazy, they just linked to an external source that happened to be public.
But is that so? This is an interesting example, because recently there has been some cases of sabotage directly with JavaScript libraries and other open source projects, and it's really more driven by the CI/CD pipelines that people have created to continuously go grab the latest version of fill in the blank and just dump it in without any sort of testing or validation, and then all of a sudden you introduced a poison pill into the environment. I don't know if that is just overly trusting or if it's lazy, because I think they built the automation to do this. They thought about it, at least long enough to think hey, I should continually pull this down and, deploy it. But the fact that they haven't actually verified that this is not going to steal your data or do something crazy.
Well, there's two sides to that, right? And one of them is, I think it's a trust slash lazy issue. And the trust part of it comes in is that as a general rule, you can trust open source software. Frankly, you can trust it more than proprietary software because there are eyes everywhere looking at the software in theory. Mm-hmm. So, and it's something, it is a respect and a trust that's been built over decades. This isn't new, right? Free software goes all the way back to the 80s. Open source is something that was coined in like late 1999, but it's the same theory, right? And when you think about it, you download Ubuntu or you download Rocky Linux or whatever, you know that there's a community behind it that's checking those things. So there's this inherent blind trust. I have no problem downloading whatever updates Ubuntu sends me, ever. It's just do it. And if my laptop blows up, I restore from backup. And for the record, it's never blown up except when I couldn't wait for the stable release. It's never blown up from a stable release. But then there's the other side of it. And this is actually, I think, more important because, yes, trust and simplification is great. I mean, I can absolutely see an engineer saying to themselves, we're just going to grab the GitHub package or release or whatever, whenever it comes out, because it removes the step of having to download it, run the test, validate it, and deploy it, right? I can see that. I mean, I have this argument with my guys. It's like, no, you've got to at least test it first. But the part I can't see is the ignorance and narcissism that goes into this idea that somehow people owe you money for your free software. These developers that willingly corrupt another person's software for the sake of some statement, whether it be political or whether it be you're not backing me up financially enough. I'm sorry, do you not understand how open source works? It's the same problem with some like Elasticsearch, who got all upset because all of a sudden they realized people could use their software without paying a license fee. Well, I'm sorry, did you not read the license terms that you applied to your software? People need to kind of look, do you deserve to get paid for your work? Yes, absolutely. But if you make it open source, there is zero expectation or requirement that you are.
So I actually gave a talk at FOSDEM the last 2 years on the death of openness and freedom, driven by the business of open source. And it's specifically driven by a lot of investor greed, in my opinion. So I talk to numerous open source companies. I like to talk to people. So I'd like to collect knowledge. I'm, one of those people who just always likes to ask questions. And the thing that I was so shocked at the last few years is the evolution of the commercial open source space and how open source has really kind of been hijacked as this marketing tool specifically to have a big exit, right? I know investors who are just like, let's slap a open source moniker on this because I can get, like 2 times the valuation right now because everybody loves open source. And it's crazy. In fact, it's interesting because I don't pretend to know everything about business. I have run, various departments here at Percona. I've run, customer success, marketing. I've run like everything but sales. But we have always been, and I'm guessing Command Prompt is probably in a similar space. We do not have deep pockets. We don't go out and take VC funds, right? So we know that, hey, we need to be good to the customers. They'll pay us for our services. We'll give them good value. And then we'll, we're not going to spend more than we have. We're not going to get these giant things. And what always is just, it's makes you scratch your head sometimes that, companies go out there, they don't even have a commercial product. They get $1 $100 million in funding or whatever. And then they go out and they spend all this money to try and like grow their, community, and then they still don't make money. So then they go get another $100 million, and then they get another $100 million, and they just keep on adding, but they keep on producing less and less. And it's weird. This year, I was talking to some CEOs in the open source space, and they're like, a lot of this is because Jeff Bezos once famously said, if I ever turn a profit, you should fire me because I need to invest in growth and I need to take all the money I can get and just invest in faster growth, and that will solve everything in the end. Now, in the case of Amazon, it worked, but probably the other 1,000 companies that tried that, they all went bankrupt.
Trip down memory lane. Do you know what Nautilus is? You use it every.
Sounds familiar. I mean, like I know, like the Nautilus machine.
What's your desktop?
That used to exist, the exercise machine. Like that's the first thing. Oh,
okay. I'm sorry.
Right now it's Mac OS.
And you launch the file browser. That's Nautilus.
Okay. Yeah.
When Nautilus was built, they were funded by $15 million in VC. They were way ahead of their time, and the goal was to create a software store. Think Ubuntu store. Okay, for GNOME and free software. And they didn't make it. They went through 15 million. But they had a decent idea, and their software lives on today in the majority of Linux desktops. Okay? There's something that came from that 15 million. The problem that I see today is that, like you said, they keep taking money. Well, now, not every company, but lots of companies have a innovative idea, but they don't want to share it. But they want to call it open source. So they launch their own cloud company. Now, that's okay. Fine. If you can make money at that and you're good at it and you can you treat people right, awesome. Good for you. But then their mindset shifts and they start calling anybody who's not on their cloud a legacy customer. The whole goal is to get them on their cloud. Now, here's the problem with that. The cloud is huge. It's what? 4 billion, 4 trillion, something like that. It's a lot. But it's only like 5%. There are companies literally who legally cannot move to the cloud. And these companies are not small companies. There are companies that are never going to put $1 trillion of revenue or GDP or country or whatever into these clouds. Now, they might build their own cloud using something like OpenShift for their own internal environments, right? But they're not. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's
and
all
I've seen that a lot.
Internal, and it strikes me as so exceedingly arrogant, as well as just out of touch with reality, to say that because you're not on my cloud, you're a legacy customer. Think about what you're saying to the people that feed your kids. The people that make it so you can provide health insurance, 401k, or whatever the equivalent is wherever you are. You were saying that these big companies who have taken a risk on your startup, who has proven nothing except that you can build interesting technology, you're not profitable, you continue to raise Series B, Series C's, now you're a unicorn. Guess what? Unicorns don't exist. And you're asking them to trust you, and then you respect them that way? It's embarrassing to me that these companies are doing that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a weird market, right? And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I see from a company that's trying to start out in that open source space is you look at who you would emulate, right? Like, so, and I'm not asking you personally, because based on our discussions, I kind of know who you think it would be like, a good open source steward and who you would but think about like the redefinition or the reclassification of what is open source. We coined the term open source, and we have OSI standards that, to be an open source license, you need to be complied to this. So, okay, we're not going to comply to that, but we're still going to call ourselves quote unquote open, right?
This is great, actually, that you bring this up. Any company in the United States who declares that they are open source, that is not using a license that has been vetted and validated by the Open Source Initiative, legally cannot call themselves open source. That came down from the courts just a couple of weeks ago, because there were so many companies out there that maybe they were once open source and then they went to this source available, shared source stuff that were still saying, oh, we're open source. And they legally cannot now. So you can expect a wave of terminology changes, because you can't do that anymore, because it's lying to the public. Yeah,
well, it'll be interesting to see, because I'm sure that's going to get, I know what court case you're talking about. I'm sure it's going to get appealed, because, who wants to lose their money ticket? But on top of that, what's interesting is the rise of quote unquote compatible. It's open source compatible or Postgres compatible or MySQL compatible, which is like, you're like, what does open source compatible mean? It means not open source at all, but you could use it with it, right? Like, I mean, that's really what it is.
Well, a good example is Amazon Aurora, right? Or Postgres on Spanner, right, with Google. They're not open source, not at all. What they did is they took the Postgres protocol and then whatever of the top layer of the user interface with the SQL dialect and all that they could work with, and they did that. Mm-hmm. And that's great. I mean, especially for Postgres. Postgres is specifically designed for that. That's why a lot of people don't know this, but if you're running Informix, you're running Postgres. Okay. In fact, you're running the original Postgres, not PostgreSQL Postgres, because it goes Ingress, Postgres. Postgres became Illustra. Informix bought Illustra because Informix in their old architecture couldn't go any farther, and then became the next Informix, and then IBM bought them. Okay. So if you're running Informix, you're running the original Postgres. But this happens all the time with Postgres, and that's perfectly okay because we are a BSD style license. You're allowed to take from it. Please do. It's the proliferation of the technology. I mean, another good example would be VMware Greenplum, right? Although VMware Greenplum is open source. So there's nothing wrong with that, but there is a serious problem when a company or an individual, well, let's put it this way. From an ethical perspective, if you are going to take, you should give back. If all you're doing is taking, you're a cannibal. You're not good for society. You're terrible for society. I don't care how much money you say you're making for somebody else because you took this technology. You have to give back in some way. Now, it doesn't have to be code. I think that's something that engineers make a lot of mistakes. Oh, they don't give code back. They don't give code back.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? That's not their talent. Maybe they, I don't know, run free conferences.
Yeah.
Give training.
Yeah.
Or sponsor.
Yeah. And I can tell you even from an engineering perspective, the most critical contributions are generally feedback. And bug reports and testing and, the education.
All the things that engineers don't like to do.
Yeah, right. So I think that those are all super valuable. Now, don't get me wrong. See, here's the thing. Like, I have no qualms with proprietary software, cloud providers, whatever. Yeah. I have qualms with questionable terms or things that are kind of shady, in my opinion, which are those things.
Don't sell me a Toyota and then give me a Vega.
There you go. Right. Like, yeah, I just believe in transparency. Right. So I think all things equal, open source is going to, win hands down. It's going to have more contributors. It's going to evolve quicker. It's going to have a better, track record over the long term. You're going to have a lot more flexibility. I think that it's going to be more innovative. But if you choose to use Oracle or Microsoft products or a cloud provider, that's cool. But I don't like if you think you're using an open source product and you're not really, and then you get into a situation where you're stuck. That just drives me nuts.
No, and I agree with you there, but I think there's a flip side in that what people don't realize is that you are running open source, period. You cannot browse the web without running open source.
It's true.
85% of the world runs a distribution of Linux. It's called Android. Your Mac is based off of free BSD.
Oh yeah.
Everybody, when you go and if you're one of these people, God help you, I love you, I just don't understand you. If you've got one of those fridges that now have TVs on them, touch screens and all that, okay, you're running open source, right? Every time you get on a flight and you push a button that says, show me the latest episode of whatever so that I don't have to realize that I'm sitting next to this guy snoring, you're using open source. So from that perspective, open source has already won. The part where it hasn't won is with people or companies, certain companies, understanding the value beyond the dollar. And I'll give you a perfect example. I used to sit on the board of Software in the Public Interest. Software in the Public Interest is the nonprofit 501c3 that is the nonprofit for Debian, for example. It's also a nonprofit for LibreOffice in the United States. It's a nonprofit for PostgreSQL.org, although some things are happening there because there's other nonprofits for PostgreSQL. And we went to a board meeting in New York. This was, and the president sat down, B. Dale Garby, legendary open source free software guy. He's now retired. Sits and goes, "Damn, guys, we won." And I looked at him and I said, "Not until GitHub is open source." Because don't get me wrong, I love GitHub. It's smart, it's intuitive, it's made contributing to projects really easy. Pull, merge, all that stuff is great. And I don't knock them a minute for making the money they made. And I don't knock them a minute for Microsoft buying them. But as long as the revenue that is generated from open source is closed source, we're losing. We're basically being taken advantage of. And you know what? That's what we signed up for because of our licensing. But if you look at it from will open source ever win? Not until these companies say, okay, and I'll give you a perfect example. I 100% understand why you would not make GitHub BSD licensed. That would be a terrible idea. But it could be GPL.
Well, but the problem, I don't want to call it a problem. It's the perceived problem with GPL, right? Not my problem with GPL. The perceived problem with GPL is someone can take my code and run a cloud service that competes with me.
That is true. That is true. But here's the thing. By and large, people are lemmings. And if you've already established yourself as the provider, why would I go to Gitfo when I have GitHub right here and they are the canonical source? That being said, also keep in mind, it's no different than Linux distributions. Why do we have 100 different Linux distributions? Because they all solve a different problem.
But I think the difference with Linux distributions, and by the way, I started on Slackware, so back in the day, the difference between Linux distributions is they are designed to be that free and open, and then there has been a few companies that have been able to monetize, but the large majority have not, right? The large majority have not of distributions. And I think that largely the concern is more FUD than real, honestly, because it's like the SSPL movement now, right? Let's be honest, God dang it all, they have money that should be mine.
Yeah.
It's not like the companies aren't growing. It's not like they aren't, don't have 500 million in sales. It's that they want 600 million in sales. Right. And they're unfortunately spending $1 billion to get the 600 million in sales. But that's, so how do we close the gap? And we prevent the other guys from stealing stuff that's mine.
Except
and that's
we're
a mentality
not
in a lot of people's minds. I'm not saying that we're not, but in a lot of companies' minds, they did not get into the open source game to share the code and to share potential profits. They got into it to convince people to start up. It's shareware 2.0 or 3.0, depending on.
You're not wrong, but on the other hand, the way I kind of look at it is, okay, so you launch this company using open source as your marketing capability, not even advocacy, right? It's different to get people to use it because you know that people are, open source is the hot new thing. And then, oh shit, people are using it and not paying me. Well, yeah, that's what open source means. And if you want them to pay you, you have to offer them something worth paying for. There are people that pay for Ubuntu. I don't, because I don't need to. I don't have that need. But there are plenty of people that do. Red Hat has cornered the market on that. It's about now, and there's nothing stopping them. And this is what VMware, one of the largest companies in the world, does with Greenplum. They have their community edition, 100% open source. You can do anything you want with it. But yes, there is an enterprise edition that makes things a little easier. Now, if you don't want to use VMware because they're an older, stodgier company, even though they're not, take a look at Yugabyte. Yonkovit is 100% open source. They're considered one of the unicorns of the database space at this point, but they didn't go SSPL. They didn't go, you can do anything you want as long as you don't make a cloud provider like Mongo, right? They said, you know what?
Yeah.
We're going to make our stuff we're going to make the value of running in our cloud or buying our enterprise version enough to where you're going to want to buy it. But you know what? If you're geeky enough or you have the skills, do a GitHub pull and have at it. Just do us a favor and give us some feedback.
No, I think that's a great model. I've had Karthik, the CTO, founder of Yonkovit, on with me, and he's talked extensively about that. I mean, he comes from that ecosystem, though, right? So he was one of the original folks on the Cassandra project, right? And so he's got a pedigree and a background that kind of understands that open source space, which is cool.
Well, he was actually the first guest on my podcast. Yeah, it worked out pretty well. He's a great guy.
Yeah. Real engaging, good conversation. Go check it out on both of our podcasts if you want more details, right? Yeah. Super awesome there. But no, I think that part of the challenge is a lot of open source projects are a labor of love. And let's leave databases aside. We mentioned some of the people who are nuking or sabotaging their own code. A lot of these are smaller applications that honestly, or libraries that honestly I would never pay for personally. But people start to rely on them. And this is where there's this kind of interesting intersection and a lot of debate going on is how do you help these founders out? Because, we've tried like donates and, this and the other thing, and it just doesn't work. Right. So what sort of things will work to help facilitate that these awesome contributions that are out there in the open source space that people have provided can still be sustainable without having someone go hungry? And, a lot of times, you start as this labor of love. And I've, had this before where you're like, this is cool, I want to do this. Yay. And then all of a sudden it gets popular and you're like, I have no time to do this. So you have to shut it down, or you have to change, there has to be some middle ground, and I don't know what that is yet. But
I can't remember where the article was, but there was an article recently about this very problem. And this problem, let's be clear to anybody listening, this is not new. Since the first release of open source / free software, this is a problem. And it boils down to this. You've got a lot of really brilliant people who know nothing about conducting business. So they get GoFundMe, they get Patreon, they do, the GitHub donate button thing now, and they hope that somebody will give them some money. You cannot get someone like VMware or even someone like Microsoft to say, oh, hey, this is a great little utility. I'm going to put $1,000 on a Patreon. They're not going to do it. That's not how business works. So what's the next step? Well, you could provide a support contract. Well, you know nothing about conducting business. You can't provide a support contract. You don't realize that, I said I would do X, so now I need $10 million in liability insurance, which is going to cost me $30,000 a year. And now I need a lawyer, I need an accountant, so on and so on and so on and so on. So that's problem number one, is that you have these brilliant people who they truly are in their space, brilliant people, or they just happen to scratch an itch and it ended up being brilliant, but they don't know how to conduct business. And then you have businesses who don't know how to operate in the space that doesn't have a contract, doesn't have a services agreement, doesn't have a PO, doesn't have an invoice. The best you get is someone like you or me who can expense it on the Amex because we understand the two sides. Right? So what needs to happen, and some companies do exist, for example, software in the public interest. You have the ability to have software in the public interest be your business front for donations and things like that to your software project should you be accepted. What's the downside? Software in the public interest is run by a bunch of people who are brilliant that don't know how to conduct business because they're engineers. So you end up with something like Linux Foundation, but that's a different scale, right? What really needs to happen is it's in someone with far more resources than Command Prompt or frankly Percona, because it would be a big lift. But create a nonpartisan, right, flavor-free store. And the author, like, there's PyPy, there's whatever Ruby uses, there's CPAN, all those things, right, have the open source store. And you upload your software and it automatically builds out a self-contained RPM or container image or whatever. And then subscribers to this store get some level of support, probably just email or web-based ticket tracking or whatever. And there's an arbitrary number that the engineer sets, like maybe there's lots of libraries out there that people don't realize. Okay. So for example, your JPEG library that renders the JPEG images on the internet for your web browser is open source. You would never think that one of the most widely distributed libraries in the world is free. Okay. It's free. But you upload that, and if Microsoft wants the latest and greatest version, they want it supported, they say, we're going to distribute this to 1 million customers, and in exchange, it's going to cost us 0.001 cent. So they end up spending, say, I don't know, 10 grand for 1 million licenses to this. And even though it's open source, they do that because it helps fund the continued development. Now, Microsoft might be a bad example because people like Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, Apple, not that they're bad companies or good companies, that's irrelevant. But if they want that software, they can just throw 20 engineers at it and support it themselves. But there's plenty of others, right?
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a very similar model to what TideLift has been trying to do, right? Where they're trying to get people together to offer support contracts for smaller projects. So that, I do think that that's a potential area that has some room for growth. I just don't think. I wonder how long-term sustainability for a lot of these projects are, because like you said, oh great, you're going to get 1 million licenses for this thing and it's going to cost 10 grand. That's great, but how many 10 grands do you need to have before you can work on this full time?
I think that's the misconception, right? Why are you working on it full time? 99% of open source is hobbies. You don't get paid for your hobby, you get paid for your job.
Well, but this is where a lot of times a hobby can overtake the amount of time you have associated to your life. And I know several founders who started this as a hobby project and then it just grew out of control. And in order to try and keep up with answering questions and feeling that this is their baby, this is theirs, that they have to provide some level of support or answer questions or follow up on PRs. And when they don't, then people get persnippety, and let's be honest, people can get pretty nasty.
Yeah. And altruism is great. Don't get me wrong. I certainly understand, outside of the tech world, one of the things I do is convert school buses into RVs. That's my hobby. Right.
Yes. Yeah, you just traveled around the country, right?
3 or 4 states or something like that last fall. And so I also participate in those communities, and it can take up a lot of my time, but I don't expect to get paid for it because it's my hobby. And okay, this is going to be a little bit harsh, and I don't mean it that way, but it's really kind of a reality check for people that think this. On the internet, people are not real. It's bits and bytes. There was this thing when you and I were growing up called sticks and stones. May break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Get the hell over yourself. Your software project, if it is that important, it will monetize. If it does not monetize and it's taking away from you, from your health, from your heart, from your family, from your psychological well-being, why are you doing it? It does not, Control D. Delete the directory, because if it's taking from you, right, it's a balance. If it is just taking from you, it is sucking the life out of you. And if it's sucking the life out of you, it's sucking the life out of your relationships, your children, your church, whatever it is that you attend and do in your community, whether it be virtual or real. That's the real problem. The real problem is people are assigning arbitrary value to something that doesn't give back. Life is about give and take, right? You give a little bit, hopefully someone pays it forward, and you get a little bit back. But if everyone's just taking from you, yeah, I mean, it's not my life, but I say give them the finger, because I've got things that I need to do to provide for my family, my team. Percona understands this. You guys are huge open source advocates. But you're not going to invest in things that are not giving, and it's not always monetary, right? There's all kinds of getting back. But you're not going to invest something where you're not getting anything back, because it just destroys whatever ecosystem that you've built up to provide for either your family or the families that you employ.
I mean, the business aspect of open source is a critical aspect, because let's be honest, most open source projects do not operate as a business. They don't.
That's right. They don't. They're hobbies.
And it's great to aspire to be able to have a business, but even before the open source space, a lot of businesses, I mean, the majority of businesses fail after they start, right? So, whether it's a restaurant or a store or whatever, it's not necessarily easy. But I do think that it is very easy to create popular open source. It's very difficult to monetize popular open source, and that is, I think, the challenge.
Well, define the monetization, right? Because it is very easy to monetize as a service. And when I say a service, I'm not talking about cloud. I'm talking about I am the expert. Therefore, I will help you. If you have a popular open source project and it is no longer a hobby, that means it's a job. If it's a job, you get paid. If someone asks you a support question, if they don't flip up the credit card, you don't answer them. You don't have to be a jerk about it. You just say, look, this is now my job. I do not provide free support. My rates are X. And your job as the author is to provide reasonable documentation, fix the bugs that are reported, and thank them, and maybe even give them like an hour of support for free because they reported this bug, right? Make it a mutual partnership for success. But if you come to somebody who is giving you free software and expect free support, you're a troll and a beggar. Don't be a troll and a beggar. Be someone worth something. Come to the table. And I don't even to be money. I see this happen all the time. I can't pay you an incident fee. I could send you some pizza. Used to happen all in our younger days. Do you remember this? Mm-hmm. People would say, look, I don't have $120 an hour, but you know what? I can send you a pizza. And people will do it. At least there's a give and take there. But this idea that somehow because you're using my software, that I owe you something for free? I gave you the software for free. You know what the word free means, right? There's just an overall sense, and I think a lot of it is because in the world today, a lot of people think things are free. When you go to Facebook, it's free. No, it's not. The cost of
your personal information.
Yeah, you are the product. You are the fee.
Yeah.
Right? And it's all social media, Twitter. Right? There is nothing in this world that is free. You can't even breathe for free. Well, yes, I can. Really? Do you think you're not paying carbon taxes? You don't own your house. If you don't pay property taxes, even if you buy your house, the government comes and takes it from you. There is nothing in this world for free. Stop expecting that it's free and stop allowing it to have that expectation. Every open source author on this planet should say up front, I will do what I can within my parameters, but if you want extra, this is my fee. That'll change the scope of everything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that even with that, though, not everybody's going to be willing to pay for it, which is cool, but it just means that not every product even needs that level of support, right? And
well, if they're not willing to pay for it, build something else.
Well, that's the thing, right? And I think that
how many web browsers have we had?
Oh yeah, a bazillion, right?
Right. I mean, the people are still trying to invent the web browser.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. No, yeah, you're right. You're right in that regard. I mean, there's a lot out there, and people are trying different ways. But I still think that people mistake usage for value.
Oh, agree.
And I think that is a fundamental mistake, because I can have 30 million downloads a month or whatever, and that doesn't mean anyone is willing to pay me for it.
Well, here's something you and I have probably relied on more times than we can count. rsync.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
rsync, frankly, one of the best pieces of software out there. I use it for backups all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Would I pay for it? No. I'd switch to Robocopy or SFTP or whatever. That doesn't mean it's not a valuable piece of software. But how do you monetize something like rsync? Well, you don't. You have to have a community that's getting something from something else.
Yeah. No, and I think it's a difficult conversation, because you see the passion behind people. You see that certain people have created things that are so outstanding and awesome. It's just that, like, yeah, I'm not going to pay for it because I'm going to go get an alternative. Yours might be 20% easier to use than this other one, but at $5, it's not worth it, or whatever.
Well, here's another. Well, actually, he's even better. LibreOffice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Hands down, Microsoft Office is a better product, but LibreOffice is good enough. I don't pay for it. But I think there's also, you alluded to something that, how much value is there? I think there's something there. And I think if you take software out of it and produce a product, see, software it's code. It's ethereal. It's ephemeral, right? It's not something you can actually touch. It's why they used to ship you floppies or CDs, so you'd have something to touch. Go and build a couch. Go and build a Craftsman table. Go convert a bus into a motorhome. The amount of time that you will put into building something that is good, hopefully exceptional, you will never get back on the sale. It takes an enormous amount. I kid you not. The last bus I built, we were just trying to build a box. But because of the weird constraints and dimensions, it took us 2 hours to build a box. 4 sides, 2 hours. Do you think someone is going to come along at our Percona or command prompt hourly rates and pay us for 2 hours for that box? Even though it's an amazing box, it's still 4 pieces of wood nailed together. A lot of that applies to software. Now, software is not special. Show me a single, unique, in-demand piece of software that I cannot replace with something that is good enough.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a good point. There's always alternatives, especially in the open source space, and you have to see the value in what you're getting, and it has to be worth more than what you could get with the alternative, right? So there's some delta, right? So, well, JD, we are approaching our time actually, and I wanted to thank you for coming on out and chatting with me today. It's been great catching up. We do these often, so you're always welcome to come back on and chat if you're interested, and love to see you at Percona Live, or maybe we'll come across each other at other conferences. We can sit down and chat.
Oh, I'm sure we will. And it's been great. Appreciate the time.
All righty. And everyone who's watching, we would appreciate you to like, subscribe, do all those fun things that we ask you to do in social media. And let us know in the comments if there are other guests we should be talking to or other topics that we want to cover. We need your feedback. And until next time, this is the Hoss, and we will catch you later. Wow, what a great episode that was. We really appreciate you coming and checking it out. We hope that you love open source as much as we do. If you like this video, go ahead and subscribe to us on the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And of course, tune in to next week's episode. We really appreciate you coming and talking open source with us.